Hey everyone, Pastor Scott here, continuing our study into the biblical narrative here in our second week and going on with what we began last week. Now, if you happen to tune in, if you caught things online or if you were part of a discussion group, you know that we talked initially about some of the history of the Bible itself, and then we moved into the beginning and the story of creation or the two stories of creation that we find in chapters 1 and 2 of Genesis. So that was our focus last week. This week we are continuing, and kind of the focal point this time around, we call it the human condition, also known as the fall, or when sinfulness comes into our reality, or brokenness. The focal points of this particular study are Genesis 3 and 4. So you'll have an opportunity to go ahead and read those. If you haven't done so, do pause and do it now, and then we'll come back. And we're back at it now. Here we go. So Genesis 3 and 4. Again, we've heard the story of creation, particularly the 6 days of creation, the very cosmic stratosphere view, and then the second order of creation that's very human-centric, really from the ground level, and we see that the earth is there, but then creation kind of centers around God making the man, or Adam, or Adamah. Adamah means ground or dirt or earth, and that's what Adam means. It comes from that Hebrew word. This raises an interesting point, or a good point, that in the Hebrew language, names usually mean something specific, and that is something that we will see as we begin to kind of go through some of the various members of early humanity. But one point that I want to make that I think is important, even though we tend to separate chapter 3 and the fall away from chapter 1, chapter 2, I believe in my own study that actually chapter 2 and chapter 3 are one story. That it's all the story of Eden, that it begins with the good creation. Pay no attention to my phone ringing. That's ringing, and it'll ring, and then it'll stop ringing here in a little bit. So it's all one story, because creation, as we know it now, is flawed and broken. It's not perfect. It's not just the great good creation that God made, that we hear about in the first account. But so I think it's all one story, and that's something that we're going to discuss in our discussion group, how it's all one thing. Now, as I mentioned, it's how it came to be as it is now, and it's flawed, and humanity is flawed too. And I can't help but think that we see within this one story that pretty much as long as humanity has been on part of creation, as long as we've been on the scene, humanity's been broken. And I kind of think that's where we're going to come into. Now, I mentioned already Adam and his name in Hebrew. Eve means something too. Eve means mother of all living things. Adam gives Eve the name pretty much towards the end of chapter 3. We'll hear in chapter 4 about the birth of the first two sons, Cain and Abel, and we see the brokenness that came about in chapter 3 continues on through the next generation. When Cain kills Abel, then there's another son who's named Seth, and Seth is actually kind of the head of the genealogy that will come in the future. So that's all coming up, but those are some of the children of Adam and Eve that we hear about. Now, kind of getting into the story in chapter 3 by itself, if you're familiar, you know that Adam and Eve are placed, or the man and the woman, I should say, are in the garden along with all the animals and all the plants, and they've been given the command not to eat the tree of knowledge of good and evil that's in the midst of the garden. Well, right away here at the beginning of chapter 3, we hear that about the serpent, who is crafty, and really seems to be standing in for the presence of evil or temptation, whether we want to say that that's a specific being or just something that's written into the story to signify that. Either way, but tempts them through appealing to what I can't help but think is their pride, that you'll be like God if you do this. And so they're tempted, and they eat of the tree. They break the boundaries that have been set by God, and with that, everything changes. Now, it results in shame. It results in the capability of blaming someone else when God comes in and asks, "What have you done?" He asks Adam, and Adam blames Eve, and then Eve blames the serpent, and we see the blame game that they don't want to take responsibility. Really, in the long run, we see that the consequences that come about from disobedience result in broken relationship. That's something I talk about quite a bit, broken relationship between individuals and broken relationships between individuals and God. And that is really what we continue to see, which culminates, of course, in murder with Cain and Abel. And yet, kind of the most important thing that I want to kind of end with, this is just a very, very brief overview of what's happening in chapter 3 and chapter 4, is evidence of God's mercy. That we see this from the get-go, that there had been consequences listed, and those consequences are delayed. And so we see from the advent of the brokenness of humanity evidence of God's mercy. So that's a lot of what we're going to talk about. I'm going to list some thought questions along with this video, so look for those. Hope to see you in our in-person group, or at least engaging with things here online. Thanks, everyone.